some more disturbing than others. So please, if that bothers you or makes you uncomfortable, I will request that you exit the video. For those of you that do enjoy true crime ASMR videos like myself, I invite you to stay. So this is going to be the case of 24-year-old Susan Schwartz. Now, before jumping right into her case, I do want to give a little bit of background information on I'm trying to think of the right word, a tool that the law enforcement team ended up using in her case, and it is called the Queen of Hearts. Now, this unique idea first was actually used by the United States military during the Iraq conflict. Packs of playing cards were issued to troops, and each card featured a picture of a wanted Iraqi war criminal. If you are from the United States or are familiar with United States history, Saddam Hussein was a very wanted war criminal, and his face was on the Ace of Spades, while like ministers, generals, like top aides to him appeared in hierarchical structure or order distributed over the four suits of the deck. And the reason the military did this was they wanted to keep their faces on top of their minds, and it was actually very, very successful. And if you think about it, or if you're familiar, I guess, with military, you know, there can be quite a bit of downtime, essentially going to be on standby, to get up and be ready to go fight, go on a mission or whatever. So during that time, they would play a lot of cards to pass time. And like I said, this was a very, very successful tool in the military. And in this Iraqi war, all but 4 of the individuals in that original 52 card deck were either killed or captured. So 48 of the people were assisting her in making a move to Minnesota with her 2-year-old son. And as you can imagine, this set Johnson off. He was furious. He already had anger issues, had lived a life of crime, and now this woman is meddling and interfering in his relationship and gets his wife to leave him. But as is common for domestic violence, she ends up going back to him. She still loved him. She still cared for him. You know, that's not uncommon for cycles of abuse. And so, within months, she had moved back to Washington State to work on reconciling their marriage. However, during that visit, she ends up staying at Susan's house, and Susan essentially suggested and encouraged, I don't think you should go through with this. I don't think you should be with him. You know, you already left him. You did the hardest part. Please don't go back to him. And she ends up taking the advice, and she goes back to Minnesota. So just a little recap there. Mrs. Johnson is being abused by her husband. Mrs. Johnson is friends with Susan. Susan helps Mrs. Johnson move from Washington to Minnesota. Then a few months go by, and Mrs. Johnson misses her husband, still loves him, you know, kind of falls into that cycle of domestic abuse, and goes back to Washington trying to reconcile things. But Susan is with her and involved, and then Susan ultimately convinces her not to get back together with him, and so she returns to Minnesota. And just a few weeks after Mrs. Johnson's return to Minnesota, Susan Schwartz would be found dead. So, given all that we have talked about so far, Gregory Johnson had been the number one suspect in this initial inquiry. He was questioned by detectives, and he had claimed that he had been fishing in Everett with his brother at the time that Susan was killed. And that alibi was never verified to the satisfaction of investigators. And they actually remained so convinced that Johnson was their man that they decided to give it another shot and have another crack at him. In 1986, while he was serving time for a completely different robbery. So 7 years goes by after Susan Schwartz has been murdered, and they have still not been able to identify who killed her. But they decide to go back to Johnson and try to get more information. So when they go back 7 years later, Gregory Johnson actually has a different story to tell police. He now claimed that he had dropped his brother and another man at Susan's house on the day she was killed. They were only meant to rob the place, but something went wrong. No shit. Later, according to Johnson, his brother admitted to him that he had shot Susan. But police did not believe a word of this story. But they didn't have any reason to back up those suspicions. So, another 24 years would go by, and the Schwartz case would remain cold and unsolvable until 2010. So, the question is, how does this Queen of Hearts card tool come into play? Well, that was when an inmate looked down at his poker hand and saw a pretty young woman with red hair looking back at him. Flipping the card over, he started reading the case details printed on the back. Then he stopped in mid-sentence and starts reading it again. And he had realized that he had heard this story before. It had been told to him by one of his fellow inmates. The card had a hotline number printed on the back. As soon as it was convenient to do so, this inmate called the hotline number. Now, this tip that was called in was a good break and a very important one, but it was not a case closer for them. Only two things would achieve that for the police, which was either a confession or a corroborating witness, which they did not have at the time. Gregory Johnson, investigators knew, was never going to admit to this crime, especially not on the word of a fellow con and inmate. And so that meant that the police would need to come up with a witness who would put Johnson inside the Schwartz residence on the day that Susan was killed. It was in this process that they learned of a woman who had dated Johnson around the time of the Schwartz murder. Around the time, his wife had left and he had started seeing other people. So back then, she had been in her late teens, and now she was approaching 50. She was a qualified nurse, a wife, a mother, living in Everett, Washington. And so they were wondering, maybe she remembered hearing something or seeing something back then that could help out their case. And so they reach out to her to see what they can learn. The name of this woman has not been identified or revealed, because her identity was protected in this case. So we're going to give her the name of Vivian. And she wasn't exactly surprised when these detectives come knocking on her door in 2011. She had actually had this secret hope that they would show up, because there was something that she had been carrying on her conscience for a very long time. Something that she needed to get off her chest. According to Vivian, she met Gregory Johnson in 1979, shortly after he had split up from his wife. She was just 17 then, and her father had recently died, making her in a very vulnerable state, probably seeking the attention of an older man. And to call it like it is, she was easy prey for a smooth talker like Johnson. And at first, as they always are, he was pleasant and charming. But things quickly changed once she moved in with him. He suddenly became violent and controlling, turning her against family and isolating her from friends. Classic behavior from an abuser. And just to, make matters worse and throw the cherry on top, he even allowed his friends to physically and sexually abuse her. So at this point, as devastating as that information was, it wasn't enough information for the detectives. Too much time had passed for the sexual allegations to do anything about that. So this wasn't earth-shattering information, and not much that they didn't really know about him already. But that was about to change. Now, Vivian starts talking about the day this murder took place, and said that Johnson had told her to take a drive with him, and he said that he was going to go see a friend who owed him some money. Since questioning anything he did or wanted to do would result in her being beaten silence was broken by a distinctive sound of gunshots. In that moment, every instinct in Vivian's body told her to run and get out of the house, and just keep going until she was out of reach of Johnson's grasp. But she was a victim of abuse, and Johnson had terrified her so much that she didn't run. Instead, she walked down the hall, heading in the same direction he had gone. In the bathroom, she came across a terrible scene. There was a naked woman on the floor, not moving at all, bleeding from head wounds. Johnson says to her, and I'm going to center this a little bit, but he says, "This is what happens to people who screw up my life." He then lifted Susan's head by her hair, held the gun just a few inches away, and fired another bullet into her brain, execution style. Vivian had no idea who this woman was at that moment, but she figured it out later when all of this was revealed in the newspaper when they were looking for the murderer. And that's when she learned that it was Susan Schwartz. So you might be thinking, okay, why, when Vivian figured out who this woman was, why didn't she go to police? Let's talk about that. So on the one hand, Johnson had told her that she was an accomplice to murder, and therefore she was equally as guilty as him under the law. And on the other hand, he also threatens her family, saying if she were to tell anybody, that he would kill everyone in her family, which that's fairly believable if you're in her shoes, because she just saw him murder a woman, execution style. I would be terrified too. As mentioned earlier, Johnson gets picked up on other robbery charges, and so during this time, Vivian gets space from him and is able to escape his grasps, but she still remained terrified of him. And the first thing he did after his release from prison was to track her down and reiterate this warning of, you better not tell anybody what happened. Essentially saying, keep your mouth shut if you want yourself and your family to live. However, 37 years after this murder, Vivian was ready to talk, and she was going to repeat her allegations in front of a jury. She was ready to testify. She knew that Susan's family deserved justice. Now, when Johnson was confronted with Vivian's eyewitness testament, Johnson must have known that his time was coming to an end. So, rather than take his chances in court, he asks for a deal, agreeing to plead to second-degree murder. That ended up saving him from the prospect of life without parole, but it still ended up earning him a very lengthy prison sentence. So he was sentenced to serve a minimum of 24 years, remaining behind bars until, at the very least, his mid-70s. And given his criminal record, there is every chance that he would serve longer than that, and even more likely that he would die in prison. So that concludes the cold case of Susan Schwartz. I found myself wondering when I was learning about this case, what would have happened if this deck of cards tool didn't exist? What would have happened if the inmate never saw Susan's face show up on that Queen of Hearts card while he was playing poker? It is such a unique personally think it's genius. Let me know what you think about this case. Obviously, just as they all are, it's devastating, and there is never a good answer for why such evil exists in this world. I do want to say that if you or somebody you know is a victim of domestic violence, and this is for the United States in particular, there is help available. And the National Domestic Violence Hotline, which is a 24/7